not long after I arrived in Hawaii, I signed up for a class entitled Christianity in the Pacific World. I've been quick to realize that in moving to Hawaii, I had arrived in a culture, both I would say a host culture and a dominant culture, that was not my own. And that in order to give effective spiritual care to those under my direction, I would need to understand a lot more about the history and the social structures and the value of this new place in which I had found myself. And so I signed up for a class. That is how I was enculturated to learn things. You go to a place designated as the place where the people who know things are, called a school, and they give you some books and you read them and then you discuss it, and then once you can restate what's in those books, then you take a test, and now you know. That's not the way everyone in the world learns things. But anyway, when the local United Church of Christ conference office was offering a course with a resident seminary professor who specialized in the history of Christianity in the Pacific world, of course I signed up. The other students in the course were also pastors, most of them Pacific Islanders. So Native Hawaiians and Samoans, a Tongan pastor and a Maori pastor from New Zealand, and then there was me. And I can remember so clearly that very first class. The professor gave a long introduction about the subject matter we were going to cover and then asked an opening question, which was, what is Christianity? Now, I knew enough to know that I was not going to answer this first. For a number of reasons. One is age and status are important in the culture of Hawaii, and I was a young, brand new arrival, which didn't mean my contributions weren't going to be valued, but just that perhaps I wasn't going to be the one to initiate this discussion about what is Christianity. But you know, in my mind, I was already formulating a response, something like, Christianity is a constellation of beliefs and practices grounded in the life of the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, but expanded by the belief that Jesus was God's Messiah, sent to save humanity, which serves as the basis for the community which coalesces around these beliefs and practices, which is called the church. Thank you. Something like that. I had that in my pocket. I had that in my pocket as I'm listening. So I was waiting, though, first to hear what others had to say. And after the professor asked the question, there was a long pause, longer than was comfortable for me, but I still sat there. And then To'o, a Samoan pastor who was sitting just a few seats away from me, took a deep breath and said, well, and then he launched into this long story about how his father, who had also been a pastor, would canoe back and forth between the other small islands near their town in American Samoa to tend to the people there, and how often it would be a dangerous journey, and how To'o would sometimes go with him on the journey to help paddle the canoe. And also how sometimes that was also a day when the men would bring a large fish they had caught back to the village and distribute it to all the villagers based on some unspoken but broadly understood formula of who would get what, as was the custom, which was a reminder of the time that a huge storm had struck and disrupted a canoe with a father and an infant in it as they were making a crossing between islands, and the father was swept overboard, but the infant washed up in the boat on the shore alive several hours later. After 10 minutes that this story is going on, To'o fell silent, and all the rest of the students sat very quietly for a minute. And then they all nodded, and they mumbled their affirmations, mm-hmm. And the professor said, "That is a great answer. Thank you, To'o." And I know we had our confession earlier, but I have to tell you that in my little white, Western, academically achievement-oriented mind, it sort of shorted out in that minute. Because I was like, he didn't answer the question. The question was about what is Christianity, and he just told a bunch of convoluted stories about canoeing around. What does that have to do with anything? I did not say that. But I heard it as a conversation that was happening inside me at that moment. And it was because I had not yet had time to come to understand the deep value and wisdom of what in Hawaii is known as talking story. I did not yet appreciate how rich a culture can be that is powerfully shaped by narrative and sharing, and which passes on wisdom and considers important questions as much by storytelling as by reasoned debate. I did not find value in To'o's answer because I do not understand it, but the deficiency was in me, right? I couldn't access it. The deficiency was in me, and it took years to outgrow that. And I'm actually not sure I completely did. I really still prefer sort of very distinct answers to things, but I think I made a little bit of progress. And actually, the subject of that class for me might well have been just coming to understand how much I don't know. You should have changed the title for that. And it was my first of many humbling opportunities I would have in the years to come, which woke me up to the fact that many of the things I assumed were how things are done were really just how things are done in white Western culture. These experiences related to everything, to education, but also to food and family and movement, and around things like how do we talk to each other, and whose wisdom do we refer to, and how do we greet our neighbors, and what's expected of us when we see someone in need. And I have to tell you, I have never been so glad to be wrong, because I grew so much from those humbling experiences by coming to have a much more specific understanding of who I was and where I was coming from. And by having my identity, particularly my white Western identity, exist in such clear contrast to so many other identities, rather than subsumed in the sea of the assumed default identity. Now, I also did learn some other things in that class, factual things about the history of how Christianity arrived in the Pacific and how it moved and was changed as it transited through the Asian continent and through the various island groups that pepper the Pacific. We tend to think of the Pacific as like a vast, empty expanse with nothing in it, but look at a map. It is teeming with life. I learned about the many significant contributions that Asian and Pacific theologians have made to the development of Christian theology. So many ideas I wish I could summarize for you in this short time because they are so relevant to considering what our faith means in this context. But of course, we might be here all day if I did that. But briefly consider this, something like this. If our question right now is something like, how can we possibly sustain a Christian faith while our broader community seems at best disinterested in, or at worst hostile to, our identity and values? Has anybody ever thought of that question? We had an entire adult discipleship thing on that question like 1 month ago, right? How could we possibly do that? I don't know what to do. Maybe we would consider seeking an answer not from within our own context, but from some of the Chinese theologians who have been asking exactly the same question for some amount of time and come up with some really interesting answers. How do you cultivate a faith in a broader culture that's hostile to that act? Here's another question maybe we have. How do we sustain our faith while feeling like we are perpetually under threat and stress? A lot of us feel like that too. Maybe the answer might come from our Taiwanese Christian siblings who have been considering such a thing for decades. Maybe we have questions about how to pass on the wisdom of our faith to a generation whose experience in life is completely distinct from our own. Maybe we might ask some of our Japanese American Issei friends who might have something to tell us about that. My point is that the world is a lot broader than sometimes our minds lead us to believe. And also that a lot has changed in the last century. You know, we talk about the decline of the church, but we need to be a little bit clear here. It's only declining up here, okay? The actual, in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America, Christianity is exploding. Nobody is sitting around saying, what are we going to do? Our membership got cut in half. They're saying, what are we going to do? There's only 1,000 people can fit in this building. Actually, it's interesting to note the proportion of Christians in the world has remained the same since the early 20th century. What's changed is where those Christians are. Christianity used to be 95% Western European and American. Now it's 63% Western European and American. The expansion of Christianity in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa have made a huge jump. So when we talk about the church today, we're talking about an entity which more and more is centered in the Asian, Pacific, and African experience, and those bodies of knowledge and culture and experience. I mean, here's just a very concrete example. There are 10 times as many Presbyterians, people sitting around talking about nominating and elders and blah, blah, and John Calvin. There are 10 times as many Presbyterians in Korea than there are here in the PCUSA, 10 times as many. Right? So when we interact with our Korean American Christian siblings, it's not as if we're receiving like some minority report of the faith from out on the fringe. They are bringing to us the majority opinion about global Presbyterianism. Is that sort of a perspective changer? Which reminds me that there is this emeritus professor at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago named Stephen Bevins. He's a priest and lived for a number of years in the Philippines. He also wrote a book almost 30 years ago now. It's not a new one, but it's called Models of Contextual Theology. Real bestseller. Models of Contextual Theology. But it really captivated it when I read it and still informs my thinking in some way about mission. Bevins is a missiologist. Any of you ever met a missiologist? Okay, one or two of you met a missiologist. Means he studies what happens when the gospel migrates around the world. Have you ever thought about that? What happens to the gospel? It's going all around. What happens to it? Does it change? Does it stay the same? What happens? In his book, he explores various models for thinking about mission and evangelism. He reminds you that one way of thinking about sharing the gospel is that nothing happens to it as it's shared. It remains the same. One group has it and then copies it over to another kind of missionized group. Does that make sense? I'm sure we've all sort of had that idea before. So the news is transmitted, maybe by a missionary or translation or some other form of sharing. It's received in its original form and practiced that way. We like that idea. We might not like it as I'm saying. We like that. God and you, there is no turning. It's all going to be the same. This, of course, privileges the experience and knowledge of the missionaries. Why? Because they have the original copy of the gospel and therefore perpetually serve as the resource for understanding or using it. This is especially problematic when the spread of the gospel is fused with certain aspects of culture, economics, or colonialism, casting the missionary as a resource not only for what the faith is, but also how to live generally, right? That becomes very problematic. So that's one way we can think about mission and evangelism. Another way Bevins says we can think about mission and evangelism is to imagine that the gospel is shared from one group to another group with the expectation that the receiving group will modify it so that it better fits in their own culture, though the core of it will remain the same. Now, maybe that sounds a little bit better to you. We've all likely seen different iterations of Christianity as they are practiced around the world, but that perspective also has its own limitations. One is that there is little impetus for the missionizing group to learn anything about the local iteration of faith because that's for those people over there. They made that for themselves and they can do that, and that's great. But I want to tell you about a third idea that Bevins had. I have to give a little preface. It's pretty radical. I don't know if you're up for that this morning. Are you a little bit up for some radical stuff? I can never tell. You know, people have had coffee. It's low Sunday. So here's Bevins' third idea about how we think about mission evangelism. Another way to think about mission evangelism is that when the gospel is shared with a new culture or people group, more of it is revealed. More of the gospel is revealed. We get more clarity on the good news. We come to understand more of God's purpose for us when we share the gospel with others and they shed their light on it. Thank you. So radical. It is, though. It really does challenge a lot of our fundamental thoughts about what does the gospel mean and what does it mean that it remains the same. I mean, I hope you hear how radically different that is, how it changes everything right down to the impulse of why we do evangelism. Instead of, hey, let me help give you something you need that I have. It's, hey, can you help me to understand this thing that's really important through the lens of your experience? I think it might be really meaningful, but I can't understand it without you. For me, that totally changes how I see mission and also tracks with my experience of sharing faith with those who have drastically different cultural backgrounds and histories than I do. Because it tells me that I cannot know God fully unless I know God with them. I cannot know God fully unless I know God with them. And that is so powerful and beautiful and humbling. And I've got to tell you, also, sometimes it hurts. Sometimes it means walking through their pain or receiving reports about generational trauma or racial violence, of cultural erasure, or the damage of the model minority myth. Often it means sitting with the discomfort of the fact that the perpetrators of those crimes were people who shared the same cultural conditioning about how things are that is active in me. So it's tough, but it's also beautiful. And ultimately, I think that painful work is healing work. It's enriching work, as it reveals more the tapestry of God's desire for this world with its threads of justice and equity and joy. Now, I have to tell you, I loved living in Hawaii. But I don't stand up here today talking to you as a Pacific Islander, and I don't mean to claim any of that culture of my own. Actually, I will say I never felt like Hawaii was really my home, in the way that we use the term home to mean the place where everything is familiar and comfortable. But I do feel blessed to have shared my journey with so many faithful souls whose experience this month ahead of us is meant to uplift. And I can say that I came to think of Hawaii as our home. Ours meaning all the other people who shared life in that place, many of whom had much more of a right to it than I did, but who were gracious to let me learn alongside them. When people ask me if I miss living in Hawaii, and I say yes, that's what I'm thinking about. Yes, I'm thinking about the beaches and the weather and the food, but I'm also thinking about friends like To, who later became a very close colleague for me. I really wish I could talk with him about the world today and what sense he's making of it. I wish I could hear more of his stories, and I could be reminded of his definition of our faith, which now, against my dry explanation, makes my explanation seem very lifeless. Because I have realized in the intervening years that I think he was right. Christianity is about going on a journey to share the word. Christianity is sharing fish on the beach. Christianity is about provision that's enough for everyone if we pay attention to how it's divided amongst us. And Christianity is about salvation. It's about following Jesus on a sometimes dangerous journey, which is ripe for misunderstanding, which means being asked many times, do you understand where we're going? But a journey that in the end gifts you with a grace you didn't expect. That gives you a life that you thought was gone forever, and you see it washed up on the shore at your feet, alive and crying out to you to tend to it. I think Christianity is about that journey, and it's an invitation to put our oar in the water with all those who share it and who want to go on it together. You know, anyone who knows me knows that there is one thing that I love above many other things in my life, and it's bread. I love bread. I love every iteration of bread that there is. And one joke that I would share with my friends in Hawaii is that it is not a place for bread. But I now have a big place in my heart reserved for rice. And that nourishes me. And it expands my understanding of what God might have for us as a world and as a church. And I just wanted to share with you a little bit about that journey today. And I want us to continue on that journey as we sing the song of response today, The Rice of Life, which we're going to do with Heidi. You can sing from your seats as we prepare to come to the table where all will be fed. Amen.